They say taxes are the price we pay for civilization. But in America, civilization is no longer paying evenly. A teacher in Ohio loses a week's salary every April. A nurse in Texas works overtime just to cover her tax withholding. A single mother in California watches her refund vanish into medical bills. Meanwhile, some of the biggest corporations in the United States pay nothing at all. If you want more stories like this, consider subscribing. It truly helps the next chapter. This is the quiet fracture running beneath the American economy. A moral breach disguised as policy, paperwork, and compliance. The middle class pays the bill, the wealthy pay the lobbyists, and the tax code becomes the battlefield where fairness quietly dies. Every loophole has an author, every exemption has a beneficiary, and every legal tax avoidance scheme has a silent loser. The people who cannot afford accountants, trusts, shelters, or offshore doors that stay open only for the powerful. Look at the numbers. The tax burden on working Americans has barely moved in 20 years. Yet corporate tax contributions have collapsed to historic lows. The system promises equality, but delivers hierarchy. The rules are the same. The interpretations are not. Behind closed doors in Washington, specialized tax teams rewrite the American wallet in real time. In crowded living rooms across the country, families stretch their paychecks just to stay afloat. Two Americas connected by the same system and divided by the way each experiences it. This is not a story about economics. It is a story about moral architecture, who the system chooses to protect, who it chooses to burden, and who it quietly abandons. Welcome to the collapse inside the tax code, the part no politician wants to explain, and the part every citizen deserves to understand. What Americans call the tax code is not a book of rules. It is a mirror, reflecting who holds influence, who writes the fine print, and who pays for decisions they never made. Most citizens believe taxes are straightforward. Earn money, pay your share, support the system. But the reality is a maze of engineered exceptions, carved out across decades by people who never appear in public debates and never stand in line on filing day. The origins of modern inequality in American taxation are not accidental. They began quietly through small revisions, technical notes, and late-night committee edits that shifted billions of dollars without a single headline. Each change looked harmless. Each adjustment seemed administrative. But together, they created a system where responsibility flows downward and privilege flows upward. Consider the pattern. Every major tax reform in the last 40 years promised fairness. Yet each cycle delivered more complexity. Complexity that only the wealthy could afford to navigate. For regular Americans, the tax code became heavier. For corporations, it became optional. Behind every loophole is an architect. Behind every deduction is a deal. Behind every temporary exemption is a network of advisors who know exactly how to convert influence into financial invisibility. The most painful truth is this: America's tax system functions exactly as designed, not for efficiency, not for clarity, but for selective advantage, a structure where compliance is a duty for some and a strategy for others. This is the moral collapse hiding inside paperwork, the story no refund form ever tells. For most Americans, tax season feels like a personal ritual. Gather documents, calculate income, subtract deductions, hope for a refund. The steps are predictable. The stress is familiar, the numbers hurt, but the rules seem fixed and unavoidable. Yet hidden behind this annual routine lies a story of selective engineering, one that began long before online filing portals and standardized forms. The modern American tax code was not built in a single moment. It evolved through thousands of revisions, nearly invisible to the public. Technical language replaced plain speech. Specialized committees replaced open debate. Rules multiplied faster than explanations. In the shadows of this complexity, new pathways emerged for those with influence and resources. The tax code became not a civic duty, but a design project. The earliest cracks appeared in the late 20th century, when corporations began treating taxes not as obligations, but as strategic expenses to be minimized. Entire departments were created not to innovate products or improve services, but to find legal ways to avoid paying a system that funded the very infrastructure they profited from. Tax avoidance wasn't seen as unethical. It was marketed as smart business. Meanwhile, for ordinary workers, the burden remained steady. Wages were taxed at the source, automatically withheld without negotiation. Filing errors could lead to penalties. Deadlines were strict. A missed form could bring months of anxiety. There was no strategy, no team of consultants, no offshore escape hatch. Responsibility was inescapable. Compliance was obligatory. By the early 2000s, a new industry had formed around the wealthiest Americans, a network of legal advisors, accountants, and policy architects who created custom-built interpretations of the tax code. These weren't illegal. They weren't even hidden. They simply required access, money, and leverage. Trusts were restructured. Profits were relocated. Corporate headquarters became movable concepts. A company could be headquartered in Delaware, operate globally, and pay taxes nowhere near proportionate to its earnings. The result was moral asymmetry. The more a person or corporation earned, the more optional taxation became. The system intended to balance the economy instead helped tilt it. The tax burden shifted downward, not by law but by structure. It was the geometry of inequality. Congressional hearings occasionally addressed the issue. Dramatic soundbites filled the news. Executives were questioned. Politicians promised reform, yet each time reforms were diluted before reaching a vote. Lobbyists understood the math of influence better than any economist. The cost of preserving loopholes was far lower than the taxes those loopholes avoided. For the middle class, the changes were invisible, yet deeply felt. School districts struggled for funding. Roads decayed faster than they were repaired. Public services shrank, local budgets tightened. When citizens asked why, they were told the same thing: there isn't enough revenue. The missing revenue had a source, but not a face. The deeper truth is that taxation in America no longer reflects a shared responsibility. It reflects a hierarchy of access. Those with resources operate above the system. Those without resources operate within it. The American dream once promised upward mobility through hard work. Today, upward mobility often requires escaping the tax system altogether. This episode is not just about dollars collected or dollars avoided. It is about the moral cost of a structure that rewards distance from responsibility. The tax code, once imagined as the backbone of a fair society, now functions as a filter that separates those who contribute from those who are exempt by design. And this design is far from accidental. It is the result of decades of quiet engineering, a blueprint for inequality written line by line in the language of compliance. The deeper one examines the American tax system, the clearer a pattern becomes. The rules that affect everyday citizens are simple, rigid, and heavily enforced. But the rules that shape the fortunes of the wealthy are flexible, interpretive, and constantly rewritten. This divide did not emerge suddenly. It grew through decades of calculated adjustments, each one small enough to avoid public outrage, but powerful enough to shift billions of dollars in responsibility. During the early 2000s, corporations realized something profound. The tax code was not just a legal framework, it was an opportunity landscape. With the right advisors, a corporation could legally reduce its tax burden to near zero while maintaining full access to American infrastructure, courts, consumers, and protections. The cost of such advisors was trivial compared to the savings. So a new era began, not of tax evasion, but of tax engineering. Ordinary workers had no equivalent tools. They faced fixed withholding percentages, limited deductions, and standardized forms that punished even minor mistakes. A late payment could lead to penalties. A missing document could trigger months of correspondence. The system treated wage earners as predictable revenue. It treated corporations as clients to be negotiated with. As globalization expanded, the disparity widened. Corporations began shifting intellectual property to low-tax jurisdictions. Profits generated in the United States were reclassified as foreign earnings, even when the products, workers, and customers were all American. The result was staggering. Trillions of dollars that should have funded public goods sat locked overseas, waiting for special deals to bring them home with minimal taxation. Meanwhile, American communities absorbed the consequences. Schools cut programs, cities delayed repairs, local governments raised fees to compensate for disappearing revenue. The middle class, already stretched thin, found itself funding the backbone of the nation, while multinational corporations contributed a fraction of their share. Even when lawmakers attempted reform, the influence networks surrounding taxation proved stronger than public pressure. Draft bills were softened, key provisions vanished. Lobbyists inserted language that preserved the very loopholes reformers tried to close. The process repeated year after year. Promise fairness, deliver complexity. The tragedy is not only financial, but moral. Taxes were once understood as shared responsibility. The cost of living in a society that offered opportunity, safety, and stability. But as the wealthy engineered their exit from this responsibility, the system lost its ethical center. The gap between what is legal and what is right grew wider. America now stands at a crossroads. One path maintains the illusion that the system is fair because the rules appear equal. The other path acknowledges the truth. Equality on paper means little when the powerful can rewrite the paper. The collapse is not coming. It already happened, and its impact is carried quietly every day by the people who have no choice but to pay. By the late 2010s, the American tax structure had evolved into something far more intricate than a civic system. It became an ecosystem, one where influence circulated like currency and access determined outcomes. Wealth no longer simply bought comfort. It bought the ability to shape entire financial realities. Corporations perfected the practice of strategic presence. Headquartered in one state, operating in another, taxed in a third, and storing profits in jurisdictions no employee had ever visited. Intellectual property, once considered a tool of innovation, transformed into a financial vehicle. Patents were relocated, trademarks reassigned, licensing fees rerouted, all to push profits across invisible borders that only existed on paper. Meanwhile, wage earners remained anchored to the physical world. A teacher could not relocate her labor to Ireland. A mechanic could not classify his paycheck as international licensing revenue. The rules that offered escape to the powerful were inaccessible to those who needed them most. When Congress attempted reforms, the proceedings exposed an uncomfortable truth. The people most affected by the tax system were the least represented in its creation. Experts spoke in coded language. Advisors testified cautiously. Lobbyists sat quietly in the background, their presence unspoken but unmistakable. The public watched hearings that resembled performances rather than solutions. Even when bipartisan agreement emerged, it often dissolved under pressure from donor networks. Key provisions were softened. Revenue impacts were recalculated to seem harmless. Entire sections of proposed legislation were replaced at the last hour with industry-friendly language written outside the Capitol walls. At the same time, communities across America were forced to make impossible choices. Small towns cut emergency services. Urban districts closed libraries. Rural counties delayed bridge repairs. Across the nation, citizens paid more but received less, unaware of the billions of tax dollars that had been engineered into absence. The psychological impact was even deeper. Many Americans began to believe the system was unchangeable, not because they agreed with it, but because it felt untouchable. This resignation was not accidental. A complex system benefits from public exhaustion. When people believe fairness is unattainable, they stopped demanding it. Yet beneath the discouragement lies a clear understanding. Taxation is not merely a financial mechanism, it is a moral contract. Every exemption, every loophole, every negotiation reflects a choice about who matters and who does not. The collapse of this contract has consequences far beyond lost revenue. It erodes trust, diminishes civic unity, and frames inequality as an acceptable outcome. The American tax system did not fail by accident. It was steered, shaped, curated, and the beneficiaries understood that as long as complexity persisted, accountability would remain elusive. The collapse of American taxes didn't happen suddenly. It happened the same way most moral failures do, quietly, gradually, behind closed doors where paperwork speaks louder than citizens. In the early decades, property taxes were predictable, wages were understandable, and communities could still see where their money went. But the cracks were already forming. Every loophole written for one corporation became a template for the next. Every exemption crafted inside a quiet office became a burden shifted onto households who never saw it coming. Today, those two timelines, past and present, sit beside each other like mismatched puzzle pieces that were never meant to fit. And yet they shape one another in a way that reveals the moral spine of a nation under strain. Back then, homeowners worried about leaky roofs. Today, they worry about whether staying in their home is even possible. Back then, local governments struggled with broken sidewalks. Today, they struggle with entire districts collapsing under impossible maintenance deficits. Meanwhile, tax strategy has evolved from a financial tool into a weapon. Corporations once looked for efficiency. Now they engineer invisibility. Offshore pathways, stacked deductions, accelerated depreciation cycles. Each one widens the gap between those who can move money and those who can't. And in the middle of it all sits the American taxpayer, the one figure who pays in full while others pay in theory. The parallel becomes clearer when you study neighborhoods. In the past, communities aged slowly. Houses deteriorated one loose shingle at a time. Today, the decline comes all at once. Soaring assessments, shrinking wages, rising insurance, collapsing infrastructure. It isn't that people stopped caring, it's that the system stopped caring about them. Another parallel appears in political offices. Decades ago, policymakers debated tax fairness in small rooms with handwritten notes. Today, they debate it inside towering buildings surrounded by advisors with folders thicker than the very laws they amend. The complexity has become a shield, a tool that hides truth instead of revealing it. And yet, through all these shifts, one thing remains constant. Whenever taxation becomes detached from responsibility, society begins to fracture. When assessments rise faster than wages, homeowners fall. When loopholes expand faster than oversight, fairness collapses. When revenue escapes faster than communities can rebuild, infrastructure dies. The story hasn't ended. Both timelines, past optimism and present anxiety, continue to run side by side, forcing America to ask itself an uncomfortable moral question. Who is the tax system really built for? In the end, the story of American taxes is not just a story about money. It is a story about responsibility, trust, and the fragile moral contract that holds a society together. For more than a century, taxes were framed as the price of civilization, a shared obligation that kept roads paved, neighborhoods functioning, schools open, and communities secure. But over time, something fundamental shifted. The system grew, but the sense of fairness shrank. Today, Americans live in two different realities. In one, ordinary families watch their assessments rise faster than their wages. They work harder but fall further behind. Their homes, once the symbol of stability, now feel like a financial fault line, ready to crack under pressure. In the other reality, corporations and wealthy entities navigate the system like a complex chessboard, moving assets, stacking deductions, and bending rules that most citizens never knew existed. And here lies the reflection. A tax code that was built to be neutral has become a mirror of power. Whoever understands the system best wins. Whoever doesn't, pays. The deeper tragedy is that neither group sees the other anymore. The wealthy view taxes as a negotiation. Ordinary households view them as unavoidable fate. And government, somewhere between these worlds, tries to fill the gaps with bandages on structural wounds. But the moral question is unavoidable. A nation cannot function if responsibility becomes optional. A community cannot endure if the burden always falls on the same shoulders. A society cannot remain stable if fairness is treated like a luxury instead of a necessity. The future depends on whether America chooses to reconnect taxation with meaning. Not punishment, not survival, but purpose. Taxes are supposed to be a collective investment in the world citizens want to live in. When they are fair, people participate. When they are not, people retreat. This system won't change through optimism alone. It will change when people recognize that money is never neutral, that every dollar taxed or untaxed shapes the world outside their doors. Roads, schools, homes, neighborhoods, safety, and stability are all reflections of a larger truth. What a nation values, it funds. What it neglects, it loses. The moral history of American taxes is still being written, and whether the next chapter becomes renewal or collapse will depend on one question. Will the system finally serve everyone, or just those who know how to avoid it?